Before we actually get into the material of this session, we should review a bit from session 1 for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it's just a good idea to review anyway for everybody. But I also realize that in this course, there are some students that were not able to register the first week and so are just now getting into the class. And so review for their sakes would be a really important thing. So let's do that. Last time we talked a lot about what it means to be human. This is a class in the humanities. And you may remember that there were two possible types of answers in Western civilization to that question. I'm not saying that these are the only answers. I'm just saying that in Western civilization, the traditions or the main types of answers to this question have been of two sorts, and they are as follows. There has been a religious answer. The religious answer has it that in some way mankind is a reflection of God. That's the Judeo-Christian heritage part of it. Or maybe the object of the deity's interest. That would be more like Greek and Roman religion. Or mankind is somehow caught up in the larger scheme of the cosmos. So in some way, there's a spiritual dimension to life, and people are caught up in that. There's a spiritual dimension to people as well. The Judeo-Christian tradition would base its views upon certain texts from the Bible, for example, Genesis 1:26 and 27, where it says, God said, let us make man in our image and our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So that's certainly an answer that many of us are familiar with. It's been very widespread in Western civilization. Many people have believed it in the past. Many people still believe it today. One type of answer to what it means to be human. But there's another fairly significant answer that's kind of a rival to this answer. And we'll see that in the next slide. Another answer to what it means to be human kind of comes from the naturalistic or materialistic side of things. And according to this answer to that question, humans are simply one step in a long series of evolutionary steps from primeval matter, primeval life, up to something beyond ourselves that we may be evolving into. And so this, again, is something that a lot of people have believed, not just since Charles Darwin's time in 1858, but really there have been people throughout history that have sort of believed something like this. And of course, this has become the pervasive kind of dominant answer in much of public life, public school, government, that sort of thing. Very much this is the answer that you're going to get. And the process of evolution, or whatever it is generated by some unknown force or principle, maybe principle built right into the cosmos. So again, another answer, very popular answer, very widely believed today. And so these are the two, basically, that you would get in answer to this question, what it means to be human. Each of these worldviews leads to a certain way of looking at the world and humanity. So I'm going to ask you to think for just a minute. Obviously, we can't discuss this on the PowerPoint because we're not together, but just think of these answers to yourself. So what do you think are the implications of the religious viewpoint or the naturalistic, materialistic viewpoint on what it means to be human as to the ultimate meaning of the cosmos? In other words, does the universe have any meaning? Does life have any purpose? The religious answer would give you one sort of set of tools to answer that question, and the naturalistic, materialistic point of view will also give you a certain way of answering that question as well. Does the universe have any meaning? Those views definitely work out a bit differently in terms of how they would answer that question. Or how about this one? As to whether absolute values exist. Are there such things as true right and true wrong? I mean, some things are just plain right always, and some things are just plain wrong always. Again, the religious answer is going to be kind of different, perhaps, than the materialistic, naturalistic answer to that question. Doesn't mean that, of course, religious people would say, yes, there are absolute values, But doesn't mean that the materialistic person would not also say that there are absolute values, but they're going to get them from different places. The religious person is going to probably say they come from God, the nature of God. The materialistic person is going to say that they come from some other source. Maybe they're just built into the way the universe works, or some such answer as that. Then how about this question? As to any value humanity may have, do human beings have any particular value? Are they different in value than, say, the dog or cat that might live at your house, or the birds that roost in the trees outside, or the fish that swim, in the lake, or do human beings have special value that's different from those of animals, plants, that kind of thing? Again, the 2 points of view are going to have maybe different ways of looking at that. And then finally, how is human behavior to be understood and analyzed? Can you figure people out? People do some of the oddest things sometimes. And what motivates them? Are people basically good? Are people basically bad? Are they neutral? Exactly how does that work? And how do you explain both the good things that people do, the things that they do which they really don't have to do, but they do anyway out of the goodness of their motivations, or the bad things that people do that they don't have to do, but they do because of the badness or the evilness or the sinfulness or whatever you want to say of their nature. And so how do you do that? How do you understand that? The two views would lead you to some different ways of looking at that. So just to show you that these two views have their natural outworkings. So what is civilization? We talked about that last time as well. Here's our working definition. Civilization is an advanced state of human society in which a high level of culture, science, government, and industry have been achieved. Now, this is different. Civilization is different than a culture. In fact, within civilization, you can have a number of different subcultures. For example, in Western civilization, which we're studying, there is the English subculture and the French subculture and the Spanish subculture and a number of others. Doesn't mean that those are not worthy and, worth studying and all of that. But the definition is that a civilization is kind of a tier or a level above a culture. It's a higher level of human society in which culture, science, government, and industry have been achieved at a high level. And so that's why civilizations are kind of a step above cultures, and we're not talking about the same thing when we use those different words. Civilization, remember, is passed from one generation to another by means of several things that we do. For example, civilization is passed down to the next generation by means of traditions. Those are information, stories, fairy tales, rhymes, etc. We talked about the rhymes, Humpty Dumpty and Ring Around the Rosie and all of that. But also, just basic information that you get, stories that you're told, could be family stories, whatever it may be. These are passed down because they're trying to make sure that the civilization and the cultures within it are passed down to the next generation. Then there's also customs, which are life patterns, why we do things the way we do them, that sort of thing. And then training can be formal, like in school, or informal, like on television or the internet. How is civilization expressed? Well, there are two modes, the modes of reflection and human expression. And so the modes of reflection are religion, where you're trying to figure out, is there supernatural? Is there an ultimate meaning to the universe? That sort of thing. Philosophy, what is real? History, what happened? And why did it happen? And what does it mean for now? That means you're reflecting on those things. You're trying to think about them and come up with some answers. That's why they're called modes of reflection. And then modes of artistic expression, the visual arts like painting and drawing and sculpture and architecture and photography, the performing arts like music, dance, and theater, literary arts, poetry and prose being, any kind of straightforward writing, and the decorative arts like, basket making and weaving and that sort of thing, even pottery. Okay, now we get up to session 2. How did human civilization originate? How did Western civilization originate? And again, we've got the religious view and the materialistic, naturalistic view. I'm just going to briefly summarize the religious view because most of the rest of this course, we're going to be taking the naturalistic approach to this subject, but the religious view does bear some, because it's so pervasive and has had such a long tradition, we do need to mention it, and also because the religious motif, especially the Judeo-Christian motif, is going to pop up all throughout the artwork and the human expressions we're going to be looking at in this culture. So the religious view has it that people are created in God's image, but people have fallen into a degenerative state because of sin. And that explains why, they can do good things and bad things. The good things come out of the image of God. The bad things come out of their fallen nature. And history and civilization are the interaction of human choice and God's intervention. So both people, according to this view, and God make up history, make up civilization. Civilization cannot be explained just by what people have done, but God has also had his hand involved as well. Then there is the materialistic, naturalistic view of how human civilization arose. And civilization developed, according to this theory or this point of view, developed in various places independently from unknown but presumably natural causes. In other words, God didn't get involved, that civilization is the sum total of natural forces, including human actions and choices, but also, natural disasters and all of that kind of thing, which just happen as a cycle of nature, not because God has caused it. And according to this view, civilization is developed through the following stages. First is the Paleolithic Age. Human beings, according to this view, were running around for millions of years on the surface of the earth, hunting animals and gathering plants and that sort of thing. But we really don't see civilization starting until maybe 40,000 years ago. Even then, we wouldn't call it civilization. We would just call it the very basic preliminaries that are prerequisites for a civilization. So 40,000 to about 8,000 years ago is this Paleolithic Age. I'm going to give you some Greek words, which we'll look at more extensively in session 3. But the Paleolithic Age is made up of two Greek words, paleos, which means old, and lithos, which means stone, standing stone, large stone. So paleolithos means the old Stone Age. That's given to that time period because people used stone implements. Human beings used stone implements mainly. It was the time in which people seemed to use fire, learned to use fire as a tool. It was the time when some of the earlier cave art was composed. We'll look at some of that. And then I believe that's actually in your textbook, some of those pictures in the Hall of Bulls and so forth come out of this period. And the human culture was hunter-gatherer. In other words, their food came from hunting animals and gathering plants. And there were early migrations of people. People were on the move, apparently, all the time. People didn't necessarily sit around for centuries and centuries in one place because they were following the food source and possibly being attacked by other groups of people, and so people moved around. I should stop at this moment and talk about time designations. As you do readings in history more and more as the 21st century goes on, you're going to see several different alternate ways of denoting the epochs of history. Two primary ones, and it kind of goes along with the religious versus the naturalistic or materialistic way of looking at things. But the traditional way is BC and AD. BC means before Christ. So it's all that time, all those years before Christ. And so those tend to be calculated from the time of Christ backwards. So there's, assuming that 1 AD is the time that Christ lived, which is not true. He probably was born in 5, 6, 7 BC, but be that as it may. 1 AD, and then the year before that would have been 1 BC. And so then the further back in time you go, the larger the numbers. AD does not stand for after death, because at least some of that time Jesus was still alive, so it couldn't have been after his death. So we get the word AD from the Latin term Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. Anno is like the Spanish año, and then Domini is the word for of the Lord. So this is the Christian way of looking at the epochs of time and centering them on the life of Christ. So if you put down on a test that AD stands for after death, you will be graded as wrong on that test. The alternate way of doing that is the BCE/CE time designation, which is a way of denoting the same epochs of time, not changing the years at all, but just not making Jesus the center of it all. And so BCE would mean before the current era. Sometimes it's also before the common era. And then CE would be current era or common era. So just so you know what those things mean, they mean the same years, they just are a different way of designating those years. And you need to be familiar with that in this course. What was religion like in prehistory? It tells us a lot about culture. It tells us a lot about civilization. And the religious things are oftentimes a good portion of that which is left behind in prehistoric sites that are uncovered. So from whatever archaeological evidence that we are able to uncover, such as burial practices, how the dead were buried, the art that people drew in caves and other places where it was likely not to be disturbed for centuries, and various other artifacts that can be found, we can guess that prehistoric religion included the following elements, and therefore that culture had something to do with those things. Fertility and birth. So for example, the ability of women to have children successfully is a major issue in human civilization before that, or I should say pre-civilization. One of the things that's found is in your textbook, in the second chapter, we've got figure 2.7. It may vary with the textbook that you have, but you can see that little sort of rounded female-looking figurine, which is a birth charm. It's a fertility charm for women. That somehow the idea that if a woman had that, and it was a specially blessed charm, that it would give her the ability to have children. So those Venus figures are exaggerated feminine figures, which obviously have something to do with fertility and birth. Then there would be another thing that is found, another kind of thing that's found, and that is success in agriculture and the hunt. So obviously they were concerned about their food supply and the other items that they gained from hunting animals. The Hall of Bulls in figure 2.2 or some close figure in your textbook would also, show how important animals were, how sacred animals were, almost worshipped. Why? Because they're so important to life. They're so central to life. Not only were they food, but also their hides were used for clothing and to making shelters, and bone was used for things, teeth were used for things. Almost every part of the animal had some use. And so that would have been a huge part of human pre-civilization. And then, of course, death in the afterlife. We were all preoccupied with death from time to time. Death is something that we all have to face, whether we like it or not, in ourselves, but also in those that we care about around us. And the fact that the dead were often buried with grave goods. In other words, there was some concept that they were going to need certain items wherever they were going. So women would be buried with their normal implements, their cooking and sewing, and implements of crafting things. And then the men were often buried with whatever their tools would be and their weapons, that sort of things, because there was some sense that there was a continuity to life, that you might not be here, but you were going to be somewhere, and you might need those kinds of things in the afterlife. So human beings have apparently had some concept of spiritual things and eternal things, or at least that life went on somehow for many, many millennia. So that's what religion was like in prehistory, and it gives us some view of what the culture might have been like. The Neolithic Age would be the next age after the Paleolithic, and so here we find some more Greek words. Neos, meaning new or young, and lithos again being stone. So the new Stone Age, the more progressive Stone Age, from about 8,000 to about 2300 BCE. They would now not only use stone implements, but also a few metal implements, especially out of copper, because in those days there were places where you could find reasonably pure copper laying on top of the ground. It's not that hard to melt copper, and so copper would have been the metal that would have been easily used, and perhaps the first easily used metal. Now animals are not just hunted, but they're domesticated sheep and goats and cattle, domesticated dogs, those sorts of things. Instead of chasing around for the crops and the foods that were growing in the wild. Now agriculture is taking hold, and people are planting things so they don't have to be running around the countryside. They can plant the things and stay in one place. Nevertheless, there were major migrations and large settlements. People still moved around. One people group would still push another people group out of an area so that they could have it. Or, crops went bad or things didn't turn out and people moved on, just like they do today. And then this is also the time of the great megaliths. Stonehenge would be an example of that, which I visited recently in England. Really an awesome place to visit. But Stonehenge is just one great example of many, many sites like that all over Europe and the Middle East, as well as in other parts of the world. So, these are the times when people erected these great monuments, whether they were for religious purposes or astronomical observation or just to prove that they could do it as a sign of their power. Don't know. But it was the time of the great megalithic structures, along with dolmens, which are single standing stones in places like Carnac in France. And so these are some of the basic characteristics of the Neolithic age. Of course, Stonehenge, if you go there today, you see lots of people. There's hardly a time when you could visit it when there are not many people around. So evidently this picture was taken early in the morning or something when the crowds had not gathered, and there's a sort of a track around it, roped off and so forth. But it's still worth seeing, and quite the place to go if you're in that part of southern England. One of the interesting finds from the Neolithic age would have been this guy called the Iceman, sometimes known as Otzi. He was found in a frozen glacier in the Italian Alps, just over the border from Austria. In fact, some hikers from Austria were the ones who discovered him, and for a while the Austrian government, not knowing that it was just over their border, they kept him, and then Italy discovered that where he was really found was actually in Italy, and there was this big legal battle. But anyway, now he's in Italy. He's kept in a cold storage, and they bring him out once in a while to study him. He's estimated to have lived around 3000 BCE. He was evidently murdered and left for dead in the mountains, and then encased in ice for 5,000 years or some such thing. And the examination of his body has provided new insights into what life might have been like in Neolithic Europe. For example, this is a reconstruction of what he must have looked like, or something like what he must have looked like. His clothing included a jacket and trousers made of deer and goat hide. He had a cape made from grass and the bark of the linden tree. He had a bearskin hat and leather shoes insulated with grass. So this might have been what they looked like. If you'd gone back to the American frontier around 1750 on the American frontier, you would have found people walking around looking quite a bit like that, whether they were Native American or European settlers. That mode of dress and that lifestyle would have been something that would have lasted right up into fairly modern times. Then his equipment. His equipment included the copper-headed axe, so it has to be Neolithic because copper really wasn't used before that. He had a dagger made out of flint, which is a hard stone. He had a long bow. He carried around medicinal plants in a pouch, including a piece of fungus. We now know that fungus like penicillin can be an antibiotic. In those days, they probably didn't know how it worked. They just know that sometimes if you ate certain funguses, you got better if you were sick. He had a framed backpack. He was carrying dried fruit and other foods wrapped in moss. And he had a fire-making kit. So the earliest civilizations really start from the late Neolithic times. Sometime around 3000 BCE. You can push it maybe a little before that in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, which is basically Iraq and Syria. You can push it a little bit before that, but honestly, around 3000 BCE are the first major centers of civilization, mostly in the Middle East and North Africa, but also a little after that, maybe 500 years after that, 2500 BCE. We have a major civilization in the Indus Valley on the borders of Pakistan and India, and also slightly later in China as well. So Mesopotamian civilization would have been modern Iraq and Syria. They would have had competitive what we call city-states. In other words, each city was kind of its own nation. They were at war with each other. They traded with each other. The writing was cuneiform, which we'll see a picture of in a moment. And you can see what their religion consisted of. They worshiped many gods and goddesses, which makes them polytheistic, many gods and goddesses. They had a strong fertility cult in terms of sexuality being a part of worship. They had human and animal sacrifice. And they were very into astrology and other types of predicting and manipulating the future. Ziggurats were these towers that they built. Egyptian civilization involved uniting Upper and Lower Egypt together around 3000 BCE under King Menes. It was very conservative and introspective. They tried to maintain, the same culture over a long period of time. They used hieroglyphic writing, in other words, pictures symbolizing concepts. Their religion was also a kind of polytheism. They tended to focus on life after death, preserving the dead in mummies and pyramids, that kind of thing. And they had a number of different sub-religious movements, which I've listed. Then the Indus Valley civilization, as I mentioned, right on the borders of India. They had great city planning and public works. Kind of amazing how far back they were able to do things in terms of city planning, things that really were not replicated again until the Roman Empire and even into modern times. Their writing, they had a system, but we haven't been able to decipher it yet. Their religion is probably the source of some elements of Hinduism, and this civilization was destroyed by the Aryan invasions around 1500 BCE, giving rise to the caste system of, social stratification. Chinese civilization also took root along the central river valleys in China. They had multiple dynasties of kings and empires, also very introspective, and they use a pictographic form of writing, somewhat like hieroglyphics, a little bit like hieroglyphics in its beginnings. Then we move into the Bronze Age, about 2300 to about 1000 BCE, in which innovative agricultural techniques were used. They could cross-pollinate plants to get a better kind of crop. They could crossbreed animals to get a stronger animal that had a characteristic of giving more milk or having more meat or, some kind of useful thing. Mining and smelting and working of metal progressed, especially by combining tin and copper to make bronze. Bronze is not a natural element. It's what you call an alloy of two elements. But bronze is stronger than either tin or copper, and so it was kind of the technology of the day. This is the time when you find the first real formal governments. And writing is widespread at this time, mainly in the cuneiform variety, in which all kinds of business transactions and records were kept. Here's an example of cuneiform writing. He used almost like a pencil, except it's got a wedge-shaped tip to it, and you can make these different impressions which symbolize concepts. And then the Iron Age, starting about 1000 BCE up to about the time of Christ, the current era, in other words, where iron, now the technology is there to mine and smelt iron. It replaces bronze because it's harder and stronger than bronze. Writing becomes very sophisticated with the alphabetic system, which is what we use. In other words, you've got symbols for certain sounds, and you just put those symbols together to make the sound of the word. And these are the first of the large empires, starting with Old Babylon and Egypt and Israel, briefly Israel for about 60 years, Assyria, then New Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then finally Rome. So in the late Iron Age, we encounter the classical civilization of ancient Greece and Rome. These will be the focus of the next several sessions.